The water tasted different at 9,200 feet. Sarah Catherine Hawkins learned that in March of 1873, when she first drank from the spring on the rocky hillside property, her uncle had left her. The water was cold enough to ache in her teeth, clear as window glass, and it came from the ground in a way that made no sense to anyone in Silver Creek, Colorado. She'd inherited 17 acres of nearly vertical slope, studded with granite outcrops and scrub pine, completely worthless for farming, ranching, or building. The property sat a mile above the main settlement, accessible only by a narrow switchback trail that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. No ore in the rock, no timber worth cutting, no flat ground for construction. What it did have was an elaborate system of stone channels, collection basins, and underground pipes that her uncle Thomas Brennan had spent 20 years building and maintaining. The system captured water from 6 different seeps and springs scattered across the hillside, channeled it through carefully graded stone troughs, and stored it in 3 rock-lined cisterns that held roughly 2,000 gallons each. The whole operation looked like the obsessive work of a man with too much time and not enough sense. The town of Silver Creek had modern amenities. They drilled 3 deep wells in 1871, powered by steam engines, bringing up hundreds of gallons per hour from the aquifer 200 feet down. The wells supplied the growing town of 1,100 people with all the water they needed for drinking, washing, and the stamp mills that processed ore from the surrounding mines. Thomas Brennan's Hillside Waterworks was a relic, something from the early days before proper engineering arrived. When he died in February 1873, leaving the property to his niece Sarah, most people in Silver Creek figured she'd sell it for whatever pittance she could get, pocket the money, and move on to something sensible. They were wrong about that. Silver Creek had followed the same development pattern as dozens of other mining towns across Colorado Territory in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Strike a rich vein, build a camp, bring in capital, drill deep wells, construct proper buildings, transform the camp into a proper town. The progression seemed inevitable, a matter of civilization replacing frontier improvisation. Early prospectors made do with creek water and shallow seeps. Established towns needed reliable, abundant water delivered through modern engineering. Deep wells represented progress. Steam-powered pumps meant independence from the vagaries of surface water. A town with good wells could grow without limits, support larger populations, run more mills, wash more ore, build more businesses. The 3 wells drilled in Silver Creek in 1871 had cost $3,000 each, funded by a consortium of mine owners who understood that water meant production capacity. Each well could pump 300 gallons per hour when running at full capacity. The water came up mineral heavy, but usable. It supplied the town's 2 hotels, 3 saloons, 6 boarding houses, assorted businesses, and the residential area that housed the permanent population. A secondary system of smaller wells and a few remaining natural springs supplemented the main supply. The town council had mapped it all out. By their calculations, Silver Creek could support a population of 3,000 people with the existing water infrastructure, and they could always drill more wells if needed. The geology seemed perfect for it. The valley sat atop fractured granite, with good water-bearing formations. Drillers had reported hitting water at depths between 180 and 220 feet. The aquifer appeared substantial, recharged by snowmelt filtering down through the surrounding peaks. Everyone in town knew the deep wells were the solution. Surface water was unreliable, dependent on rainfall and snowpack. Deep aquifers provided steady, year-round supply. That was modern thinking, supported by mining engineers who'd worked in California and Nevada and knew how proper towns were supposed to function. Thomas Brennan's obsessive maintenance of his hillside springs seemed downright backwards in comparison. He'd spent decades fussing with rock channels, cleaning sediment, repairing erosion damage, and monitoring flow rates like the old man was running a factory instead of just trying to get drinking water. Folks in town had tolerated it as an eccentricity. Thomas was a fixture, one of the original prospectors from 1862, entitled to his peculiar ways. But when he died and left the property to his niece, people expected her to be more practical about things. The property assessment for tax purposes valued the land at $120, essentially worthless. The town council briefly discussed purchasing it for use as a municipal reservoir site, but the location was too high and steep to be useful. They offered Sarah $100 for the land. She could walk away with cash and no obligations. She turned them down. Sarah Catherine Hawkins was 28 years old when she inherited her uncle's property in February 1873. Born in Ohio in 1845, she'd grown up in a farming family near Cincinnati, the third of 7 children. Her father raised crops and kept detailed records of everything: rainfall, soil conditions, harvest yields, market prices, all written in careful ledgers that Sarah learned to read before she started school. She'd worked as a teacher for 4 years after finishing her own education, saving money with the intention of heading west to Denver or San Francisco, where opportunities for unmarried women supposedly exceeded those available in Ohio. Her plan was interrupted when her mother died in 1869, and Sarah spent the next 2 years helping raise her younger siblings. By 1871, at age 26 and still unmarried, Sarah decided it was time to make her move west. She had $180 saved, a decent education, and enough stubbornness to make her own way. She took the railroad to Denver, worked there for a year as a seamstress and boarding house assistant, then heard about teaching positions opening in the mining towns of the high country. Silver Creek needed a teacher. The position paid $35 per month, plus room and board. Sarah arrived in October 1872, took one look at the rough settlement clinging to the mountainside, and figured she'd stay a year to build up her savings before moving on to somewhere more civilized. Her uncle Thomas Brennan lived in a small cabin on his hillside property. He was her mother's eldest brother, a man Sarah barely knew. He'd left Ohio in 1859 to prospect for gold, spent the war years in the mountains, and never returned to the family fold. Sarah visited him twice after arriving in Silver Creek, mostly out of obligation. Thomas was 62 years old, weathered by 3 decades of mountain living, and he talked constantly about water, how it moved through rock, how it collected in certain formations, how to read the land for signs of reliable springs, how to build channels that wouldn't erode, how to measure flow rates by timing how long it took to fill a bucket. Sarah found it tedious at first, but Thomas was her only family within 1,000 miles, and he seemed pleased to have someone to talk to. On her second visit in January 1873, he showed her the complete system, walking her along every stone channel, explaining how he'd positioned each collection basin to capture the maximum flow, pointing out where bedrock forced water to the surface. "People think I'm crazy," Thomas said, standing beside one of his cisterns. "They've got their fancy wells now. Steam pumps, modern engineering, but this water never stops. 30 below or 90 above, doesn't matter. These springs flow at the same rate, year-round. You know why?" Sarah didn't know why. Because they're not drawing from the same place as those wells. The wells pull from the deep aquifer, couple hundred feet down. My springs tap into fracture systems in the granite, fed by snowmelt working down through the rock over years. Different source entirely. The deep aquifers got more volume, sure, but my springs are stable. They'll flow the same in wet years and dry years both. The deep water fluctuates with the recharge rate. These fractures store water slower, but they release it steadier. He showed her notebooks where he'd recorded flow measurements daily for 15 years. The numbers varied slightly with seasons, but the overall output remained remarkably consistent. The 6 springs together produced roughly 800 gallons per day, every day, regardless of external conditions. Thomas died of pneumonia 3 weeks later, in February. The reading of his will surprise everyone. He left the property, the spring system, and his detailed notebooks to Sarah, along with a short letter. This land will matter more than people think. Maintain the channels, watch the flows. Don't let them tell you it's worthless. The reaction in Silver Creek was swift and unanimous. Sarah had inherited junk. At the general store, where Sarah bought supplies, the owner Henry Morton made his opinion clear. Your uncle was a good man, Miss Hawkins, but that hillside property isn't worth the taxes. 17 acres you can't build on, can't farm, can't graze. Those old springs might keep flowing, but we've got 3 good wells supplying more water than this town will ever need. You should take the council's offer and sell. Use the money for something practical. At the boarding house where Sarah rented a room, the landlady, Mrs. Josephine Porter, offered similar advice. Thomas was peculiar about that water system. Spent all his time maintaining it when he could have been doing something useful. You're a young woman with prospects. Teaching position pays steady. You could save up for a proper business or travel to Denver, where there are suitable men. Don't tie yourself to 17 acres of rock and a bunch of stone ditches. The town's leading citizens were more direct in their assessment. Charles Whitmore, who owned the largest stamp mill and had funded one of the deep wells, encountered Sarah on the street in early March. I knew your uncle, Whitmore said. Respected him, but that spring system is obsolete. Deep wells are the future. The town council made you a fair offer at $100. That's probably more than the land's actually worth, given the access problems. Smart thing would be to take it. Even William Hayes, the assayer who'd known Thomas Brennan for 20 years, suggested Sarah sell. Thomas loved that system, wouldn't hear a word against it. But the man was living in the past. We've got modern infrastructure now. Steam pumps, iron pipes, proper distribution. His collection basins and stone channels belong to another era. No offense to his memory, but you should move on. Sarah listened to all this advice and ignored it. She spent her first weekend after inheriting the property hiking the entire 17 acres, following every channel, examining every collection basin, reading through her uncle's notebooks. The more she studied the system, the more she understood what Thomas had built. Her uncle hadn't been a backwards eccentric. He'd been observing and documenting for decades. His notebooks contained detailed measurements, but also observations about the town's wells. He'd noted when each well was drilled, tracked their pumping rates, recorded reports of any problems. And he'd written one note, dated November 1871, that caught Sarah's attention. The new wells are drawing from fractured granite aquifer at 200 feet depth. Good production now, but the recharge area is limited by bedrock formations to the west. In dry years, the aquifer won't refill as fast as they're pumping. My springs tap different fractures with slower but steadier recharge. Time will tell which system proves more reliable. Sarah understood what her uncle was suggesting. The town's wells and his springs drew from different water sources. The wells depended on an aquifer that fluctuated with precipitation. The springs drew from fractured rock systems that released water slowly but consistently. In wet years, the distinction didn't matter. In dry years, it might matter considerably. She made her decision on a cold March afternoon, standing beside one of the main cisterns, watching water flow steadily through a stone channel. The town thought she was foolish. They had their modern wells and steam pumps. But Sarah had learned from her father to trust careful records over popular opinion. Her uncle had documented 30 years of consistent spring flows. That data meant something. She would keep the property. She would maintain the system. And she would see who was right. Sarah's decision to keep the property and actively maintain it became the subject of considerable commentary around Silver Creek. In a town of 1,100 people, where entertainment was scarce, a young woman choosing to spend her weekends hauling rock and cleaning water channels provided ample material for gossip and jokes. At Hannigan's saloon, miners joked about the water girl wasting her time on obsolete springs. At the Saturday market, women exchanged knowing glances when Sarah appeared with mud on her boots from working on the hillside. The town's newspaper, the Silver Creek Herald, ran a brief notice in March mentioning that Miss Sarah Hawkins, the schoolteacher, has taken to the peculiar hobby of maintaining her late uncle's spring collection system, a reminder of earlier days before modern water infrastructure made such primitive arrangements unnecessary. The mockery wasn't mean-spirited, exactly. It was more the bemused condescension of people who thought Sarah was wasting effort on something pointless. She was a respectable schoolteacher, well-liked by the families whose children she taught. But she was also an unmarried woman in her late 20s, making impractical choices that suggested poor judgment. The most direct confrontation came in early April when Sarah encountered James Ridgway at the general store. Ridgway was 34, a mining engineer who managed operations for one of the larger claims. He'd made his interest in courting Sarah reasonably clear since her arrival, and he seemed personally offended by her decision to maintain the spring system. "Miss Hawkins," Ridgway said, loud enough for others in the store to hear, "I've been meaning to speak with you about this business with your uncle's property. You're wasting your time with those springs. The future of water supply is deep wells and steam pumps. That's engineering. What you're doing is playing with rocks and ditches like a child building dams in a creek." Sarah set down the flour sack she'd been examining and turned to face him. "Mr. Ridgway, I appreciate your concern, but I've looked at my uncle's records. The springs produce 800 gallons daily and have done so consistently for 15 years. That seems like more than playing with rocks." 800 gallons, Ridgway laughed. "Our wells produce 300 gallons per hour each. That's over 7,000 gallons per day from just one well. We have 3. Your uncle's entire system produces less in a day than one of our wells does in 3 hours. And you're spending your weekends maintaining it? That's not practical, Miss Hawkins. That's stubbornness." "Perhaps," Sarah said. "But my uncle's springs drew from different geology than your wells. Different water sources entirely. That might prove relevant." "Different sources?" Ridgway shook his head. "Water is water, Miss Hawkins. It all comes from precipitation working down through the ground. The only question is how much you can pump and how deep you have to drill. We've got the technology to access the main aquifer. Your uncle was scratching around at surface seeps. There's no comparison. Others in the store were watching now. Henry Morton, the owner, tried to defuse the situation. Now, James, Miss Hawkins has a right to maintain her property however she sees fit." "Of course she does," Ridgway agreed. "I'm simply suggesting that a woman of her education should apply better judgment. The town council offered her $100 for that land. That's more than it's worth. She could take the money, invest it sensibly, focus on her teaching career. Instead, she's spending weekends like a day laborer, hauling rock around a hillside for no practical purpose. It's unseemly." Sarah felt her face flush, but she kept her voice level. "Mr. Ridgway, I've read my uncle's notebooks. He documented flow rates, geology, and the performance of various water sources for 30 years. I trust his observations. The springs will keep flowing whether I maintain them or not, but maintenance ensures they flow efficiently. That seems worthwhile to me. 30 years of a crazy old man writing down numbers doesn't change the facts of geology and engineering," Ridgway said. "But suit yourself. When you finally realize you're wasting your effort, the town's offer might not stand. Land values don't improve on property nobody wants." He left the store. Sarah completed her purchases in silence, aware of the sympathetic and amused glances from other customers. She'd made her position clear, and so had Ridgway. The town thought she was foolish. She thought they were overlooking something important. Time would settle the question. Through April and May of 1873, Sarah established a routine. She taught school Monday through Friday, instructing 23 children aged 6 to 14 in reading, arithmetic, history, and penmanship. The school day ran from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. She lived in a rented room at Mrs. Porter's boarding house, taking meals there and keeping her expenses minimal. Saturday and Sunday, she worked on the spring system. The work was physical and demanding. Each collection basin needed regular cleaning to remove sediment and fallen debris. The stone channels required inspection for erosion or blockage. The cisterns needed periodic draining and scrubbing to prevent algae growth. The crude pipe system her uncle had installed, made from hollowed logs sealed with tar, required constant maintenance to prevent leaks. Sarah learned by doing and by studying her uncle's notes. Thomas had left detailed instructions for maintenance procedures, seasonal considerations, and common problems. He'd mapped the entire system, noting where each channel was vulnerable to winter ice damage or summer erosion. She bought tools with money from her teaching salary: a short-handled spade, a pry bar, a hammer, wire brushes. She purchased materials for repairs: bags of clay for sealing joints, bundles of metal wire for reinforcing channels, tar for waterproofing. The physical labor was harder than anything she'd done in Ohio or Denver. By the end of each weekend, her hands were blistered, her back ached, and her clothes were filthy. But the work was satisfying in a way that teaching never quite achieved. She could see direct results: a cleared channel, a repaired basin, steady water flowing where it should. She also began her own documentation, continuing her uncle's practice of daily measurements. Each morning before school, Sarah hiked up to the property and measured the output of each spring using her uncle's method, timing how long it took to fill a 1-gallon bucket. She recorded the data in a new notebook, noting weather conditions, temperature, and any maintenance work performed. The springs flowed steadily. Through April's rain and May's warming temperatures, the output remained consistent. The 6 springs together produced roughly 800 gallons per day, exactly as her uncle had documented. The water was cold, clear, and clean. Meanwhile, the town continued its rapid growth. New residents arrived weekly. 2 new boarding houses opened. A proper hotel with 20 rooms broke ground on Main Street. The stamp mills ran constantly, processing ore from the producing mines. Water consumption increased steadily. The 3 deep wells kept pumping. No problems were reported. The system worked exactly as designed. Silver Creek was a modern mining town with modern infrastructure, and Sarah's insistence on maintaining obsolete springs seemed increasingly quaint. Through May and into June, Sarah expanded her understanding of the system while performing essential maintenance. The work required solving problems her uncle's notes only partially addressed. The first major project involved the uppermost spring, a seep that emerged from a crack in the granite outcrop at the highest point of the property. Thomas had built a small collection basin here, but years of freezing and thawing had cracked the stonework. Water still flowed, but significant amounts leaked away before reaching the main channel. Sarah spent 3 weekends rebuilding the basin. She carried stones up the steep slope, some of them requiring multiple trips. She mixed clay with sand and a small amount of lime, a recipe she'd found in Thomas's notes for creating durable waterproof seals. She fitted each stone carefully, creating a watertight basin that would survive winter freezing. The work taught her about the geology her uncle had understood intuitively. The granite bedrock wasn't solid. It contained fractures and joints where water moved through slowly. The springs emerged where these fractures intersected the surface. The water was ancient precipitation, filtered through the rock over years, emerging cold and pure. The deep wells the town relied on drew from a different formation, a fractured aquifer 200 feet down, where water collected in larger quantities, but also moved more readily. The well water came up slightly warmer and carried more dissolved minerals. It was perfectly usable, but different in character from the spring water. Sarah's second major project involved reinforcing the main channel that carried water from the upper springs down to the primary cistern. This channel was carved into the hillside, lined with flat stones, and graded carefully to maintain steady flow without erosion. But winter frost heave and spring runoff had displaced stones in several locations, creating turbulence that scoured the channel bed. Sarah repositioned stones, added supporting walls at vulnerable points, and reinforced the grade. The work required understanding how water velocity affected erosion, how curve radius influenced flow patterns, how channel depth and width needed to balance to prevent either overflow or stagnation. Her uncle's notes contained principles learned through decades of observation. Water flowing too fast eroded channels. Water flowing too slow deposited sediment. The ideal was smooth, steady flow at moderate velocity. This required careful stone placement and constant vigilance for any changes in pattern. By late June, Sarah had repaired or reinforced all 6 collection basins and 2 major sections of channel. The system was functioning as efficiently as it had during her uncle's lifetime. The 800 gallons per day flowed reliably, divided among the 3 cisterns. She'd also begun to notice something her uncle had documented, but the town seemed unaware of. The deep well's output was gradually declining. Nothing dramatic, just a slight reduction in flow rates. The wells still produced plenty of water for current needs, but the pumping times required to fill the town's storage tanks were measurably longer than they'd been in 1871. Sarah noted this in her documentation, but said nothing publicly. The town's engineers would surely notice eventually. And perhaps it meant nothing, just normal fluctuation in the aquifer. But it aligned with her uncle's prediction. The deep aquifer might not recharge as reliably as people assumed. The winter of 1873 to 1874 was notably dry across Colorado Territory. Snowfall in the high country measured roughly half the normal amount. By January 1874, the snowpack that usually accumulated several feet deep barely covered the ground. Old-timers in Silver Creek noted the conditions with concern, but the town's water system showed no immediate effects. The deep wells kept pumping. The steam engines ran their regular schedules. Water flowed to homes and businesses and mills without interruption. Sarah continued her maintenance routine through the winter months, though the work became more challenging. The stone channels froze in places, requiring her to chip away ice. The cisterns developed surface ice that needed to be broken regularly, but the springs themselves kept flowing at their steady rate, the water emerging from the ground just above freezing, never quite stopping even in the coldest weather. Her teaching duties occupied most of her time through the school year, but she maintained her daily measurements and weekend maintenance schedule. The data she collected showed the spring's remarkable consistency. Despite the lack of snow, despite below-zero temperatures, the flow rate remained constant at roughly 800 gallons per day. The deep wells, meanwhile, showed their first significant problems in February 1874. The westernmost well, which had been producing 300 gallons per hour, dropped to 240 gallons per hour. The pumping machinery worked fine. The problem was reduced flow from the aquifer itself. The town engineer, a man named Robert Summers, checked the other 2 wells and found similar, though less severe declines. The center well was down to 270 gallons per hour. The eastern well was holding steady at 285 gallons per hour. Summers reported his findings to the town council in March. The reduction was concerning, but not yet critical. The 3 wells combined still produced over 1,800 gallons per hour, more than enough for the town's current population and industry. Summers recommended monitoring the situation carefully and considering drilling a 4th well if the decline continued. The council agreed to monitor, but took no immediate action. Drilling a new well cost $3,000, and the current system still met all needs. They'd wait and see if the snowpack returned to normal the following winter. Sarah heard about the well problems through the general gossip that circulated in a small town. She noted the information in her records, but said nothing publicly. Her springs continued flowing steadily, but 800 gallons per day was insignificant compared to the town's needs. The decline in the wells hadn't yet vindicated her uncle's predictions. It was just a dry winter, nothing more. Spring came late and meager. In 1874, the mountain snowpack melted quickly without the usual prolonged runoff. The creeks ran lower than normal. By June, the landscape looked more like July, vegetation already stressed and turning brown. The town's water situation remained manageable. The wells continued producing, though at reduced rates. Summers recommended water conservation measures, asking businesses and residents to use water judiciously. Most people complied without complaint. Everyone expected normal precipitation to resume eventually. Sarah's springs flowed on, unchanged. Summer of 1874 brought heat but little rain. The typical afternoon thunderstorms that watered the high country through July and August largely failed to materialize. What rain did fall came in scattered, inadequate showers that barely dampened the dust. By August, the drought's effects were unmistakable. The creeks that usually ran year-round were dry channels of stone. The valley's few agricultural operations, small gardens and livestock forage, withered. The forest became tinder-dry. Fire danger was extreme. The town's deep wells continued declining. By mid-August, the westernmost well was producing only 180 gallons per hour. The center well had dropped to 210 gallons per hour. The eastern well, the best performer, was down to 240 gallons per hour. Combined output, roughly 1,500 gallons per hour, down from the original 2,400 gallons per hour when the wells were first drilled. Still adequate for the town's needs, but the margin was narrowing. Robert Summers called a town meeting in late August to discuss the situation. Sarah attended, sitting in the back of the meeting hall, while Summers explained the problem to the gathered citizens. The aquifer we're drawing from depends on snowmelt and precipitation working down through the fractured granite, Summers said. In normal years, the recharge rate matches or exceeds our pumping rate. But we've had below normal precipitation for over a year now. The aquifer level is dropping. Our wells are producing less as a result. How long can we maintain current water usage? Charles Whitmore asked. At present rates, indefinitely, Summers answered. We're still getting enough water for all current needs. But if the drought continues and the population keeps growing, we could face shortages. I recommend we begin planning for additional water sources. That means either drilling a fourth well or developing alternative supplies. What about rationing? Someone asked. Not necessary yet, Summers said. But we should all practice conservation. Don't waste water. Use what you need, but be mindful. James Ridgway stood up. What about the cost of drilling another well? $3,000 is substantial. Can we afford it? The mining operations can afford it, Whitmore said. Water is essential for ore processing. If we need a fourth well, we'll fund it. But I'd prefer to wait and see if normal precipitation resumes this winter. No point spending money unnecessarily. The meeting ended with an agreement to monitor the situation through the fall and winter, practice conservation, and revisit the question of a fourth well in the spring if conditions hadn't improved. Sarah walked home from the meeting, thinking about her uncle's predictions. The deep aquifer wasn't recharging adequately. The wells were declining. Her springs, drawing from different geology, continued their steady flow. 800 gallons per day still seemed insignificant compared to the town's needs. But if the drought continued, if the wells kept declining, perhaps her uncle's elaborate system would matter after all. Through September and October of 1874, the situation deteriorated further. The expected autumn rains failed to materialize. The snowpack that should have been accumulating in the high peaks by October remained sparse. The drought was entering its second year with no sign of breaking. The town's wells continued declining. By November, combined output had dropped to roughly 1,200 gallons per hour. This was still sufficient for basic needs, but the mills had to reduce their operating hours to conserve water. Some businesses limited washing and cleaning. The fire danger remained extreme, even as winter approached. The town council voted in November to fund a fourth well, to be drilled starting in spring 1875 when weather permitted. The cost would be shared among the major mining operations. Summers had already identified a promising location on the north side of town. Meanwhile, Sarah's springs kept flowing at their consistent 800 gallons per day. The lack of precipitation didn't affect them. The water emerged from the fractured granite at the same steady rate, filtered through rock over years, released slowly but reliably. Sarah had made one significant addition to the system in October. She'd installed a proper distribution pipe leading from the main cistern down to a point just above the town's edge. The pipe was made from hollowed logs sealed with tar, following her uncle's construction method. It ran about 600 yards down the hillside, following the natural grade. At the terminus, she installed a simple wooden valve and a trough where water could be collected. She mentioned the pipe to a few people casually, noting that if anyone needed reliable water access, they could use her spring system. The flow wasn't large, but it was consistent. Most people paid little attention. 800 gallons per day split among over 1,000 residents would provide less than a gallon per person. It might help a bit, but it wasn't a solution to anything. James Ridgway encountered Sarah at the general store in November and couldn't resist commenting. "I hear you've run a pipe down from your springs, Miss Hawkins. Planning to compete with the municipal wells?" "Not competing with anyone, Mr. Ridgway," Sarah said. "Simply making the water accessible if anyone needs it." 800 gallons a day, Ridgway said, shaking his head. "That wouldn't run one stamp mill for an hour. Your uncle's system is quaint, but it's not a solution to anything. When we drill the fourth well next spring, we'll have proper capacity restored. Real engineering, not stone ditches and hollowed logs." Sarah didn't argue. She'd learned that defending her uncle's work only invited more mockery. She simply continued her maintenance routine, documented her measurements, and let the springs flow. Winter arrived in December with little snow. The ground froze hard, but without the insulating layer of snowpack that usually covered everything by late December. The cold was sharp and penetrating. Springs and creeks across the valley froze solid. Sarah's springs kept flowing. The water emerged from the granite too warm to freeze immediately. It flowed through her stone channels, slightly steaming in the frigid air, and collected in the cisterns where only the surface froze. The deeper water remained liquid, protected by the surrounding stone mass. She broke the surface ice daily, ensuring the system kept flowing. 800 gallons per day, every day, through the coldest nights and the driest months. By Christmas 1874, Silver Creek had gone 18 months with below normal precipitation. The deep wells were producing a combined 1,000 gallons per hour, less than half their original capacity. The town was managing, but the margins were thin. And then the winter ended early, snowpack minimal, runoff negligible, and no one could pretend the drought would break by itself. Spring 1875 brought the drought's full impact home to Silver Creek. The minimal snowpack melted in March, providing a brief boost to surface water. By April, the creeks were dry again. The forest was critically parched. Fire bans were in effect. The town's wells continued declining. In May, the combined well output dropped below 900 gallons per hour. The town's water consumption, supporting 1,200 residents and the mining operations, required approximately 1,100 gallons per hour to maintain current operations. The deficit was small but real. The mills began operating on restricted schedules. Residential water use was rationed to essential purposes only: drinking, cooking, minimal washing. Laundry services closed. The hotels limited baths to 1 per week per guest. Firefighting capacity, always a concern in mining towns, became dangerously inadequate. Robert Summers and the drilling crew began work on the 4th well in late April. The drilling proceeded slowly through the fractured granite. They hit water at 195 feet in mid-May, a promising sign. But when they completed the well to 220 feet and began pumping tests, the results were disappointing. The new well produced only 120 gallons per hour, far less than the original 3 wells had delivered when first drilled. The aquifer was severely depleted. Adding a 4th well didn't solve the problem. It just added another straw competing for limited water. The town council held an emergency meeting on May 28, 1875. Sarah attended, standing in the back of the crowded meeting hall. Every seat was filled. People lined the walls. The mood was tense. Charles Whitmore spoke first. "We have a serious situation. 4 wells now, producing a combined 1,020 gallons per hour. We're consuming about 1,100 gallons per hour. We're deficit by roughly 80 gallons per hour, or almost 2,000 gallons per day. At that rate, we're depleting our storage tanks daily. We can't sustain this. What are our options?" someone called out. Robert Summers answered, "We can drill more wells, but I don't think it will help. The aquifer is depleted. We're already drawing faster than it's recharging. More wells will just divide up the available water among more pumps. We need to either reduce consumption significantly or find alternative water sources." "What alternative sources?" Whitmore asked. "The creeks are dry. There are no lakes or rivers within 10 miles. Where else can we get water?" A long silence followed. Then Sarah spoke from the back of the room. "There are the springs on my uncle's property." Every head turned. James Ridgway laughed, a short, bitter sound. 800 gallons per day? That's barely a drop in what we need. "It's 800 gallons per day of reliable flow," Sarah said, her voice steady. "The springs haven't declined at all during the drought. They're drawing from different geology than the wells. The water's there, consistent, regardless of precipitation." "Miss Hawkins," Whitmore said, not unkindly, "we appreciate the offer, but 800 gallons per day doesn't solve our shortage of 2,000 gallons per day. It would help, certainly, but it's not sufficient." "It's not just my 6 springs," Sarah said. "My uncle documented other springs in the surrounding mountains, all drawing from the same fractured granite formations. Most of them were never developed because people thought the yield was too small. But if you're looking for reliable water that doesn't depend on aquifer recharge, the spring system could be expanded." Summers looked interested despite himself. "How many other springs? What kind of yields?" "My uncle identified 8 other significant seeps within 3 miles of town," Sarah said. "He estimated the combined flow at roughly 1,500 gallons per day if properly developed. Added to the existing system, that's over 2,300 gallons per day. Not enough to replace the wells, but enough to cover our current deficit." "This is absurd," Ridgway said. "We're going to solve a water crisis by building stone channels and hollowed log pipes like it's 1840. We have steam pumps and proper drilling equipment. The solution is modern engineering, not primitive ditches." "Your modern engineering is failing, Mr. Ridgway," Sarah said, her patience finally fraying. "Your deep wells are depleting. You drilled a 4th well and got minimal production. My uncle spent 30 years learning how water moves through these mountains. His springs are still flowing because he understood the geology you're ignoring." The meeting hall buzzed with multiple conversations. Whitmore raised his hands for quiet. "Miss Hawkins, thank you for the information. I think we need to consider all options at this point. Robert, can you and your crew evaluate these other spring locations? See if they're worth developing?" Summers nodded. "We can look. Though I share James's concerns about relying on primitive collection methods when we have modern equipment available. Check the springs, Whitmore said. We'll meet again in a week to discuss findings. In the meantime, water rationing remains in effect. Everyone please conserve wherever possible. The meeting adjourned. Sarah walked home alone, aware of the stares and whispers following her. She'd spoken up publicly about her uncle's work, something she'd avoided for 15 months. The town thought she was foolish. Maybe she was. But the springs kept flowing, and the wells were failing. Time would tell. Robert Summers was a practical man who believed in engineering but respected evidence. Despite his skepticism about primitive water systems, he agreed to evaluate the spring sites Sarah had mentioned. On June 2, 1875, he hiked up to Sarah's property with 2 assistants to examine her uncle's documentation. Sarah met them at the main cistern and showed them Thomas Brennan's notebooks. 30 years of daily flow measurements, geological observations, and carefully drawn maps showing spring locations throughout the area. Summers studied the notebooks for over an hour. Your uncle was thorough, he admitted. These measurements show remarkable consistency. The 6 springs on your property have maintained steady flow for decades, according to this data. They're still maintaining it, Sarah said. The drought hasn't affected them. You can measure today's flow and compare it to any entry in those notebooks. It's the same. Summers did exactly that. He and his assistants spent the afternoon measuring the flow from each of Sarah's 6 springs. The total output was 804 gallons per day, matching Thomas's long-term average almost exactly. Interesting, Summers said, making notes. The wells have dropped by over 50% during the drought, but these springs haven't changed at all. Why? Different water source, Sarah explained. My uncle figured this out years ago. The deep wells draw from a fractured aquifer that depends on recent precipitation working down through porous rock. The springs tap into much older water, stored in tight fractures that release slowly but consistently. The water emerging today fell as snow or rain years ago. It's been working through the rock system all that time. Summers considered this. If that's true, and these other springs your uncle documented are similar, they would indeed provide reliable supplementary water. Show me the locations. Sarah had Thomas's maps. Over the next 3 days, she guided Summers and his crew to 8 other spring sites in the mountains around Silver Creek. Most were undeveloped, just seeps where water emerged from rock fractures and disappeared into the soil. But at each location, Summers measured the flow and found it consistent with Thomas's decades-old documentation. The 8th site, a series of seeps on a north-facing slope 2 miles from town, showed particularly strong flow, over 400 gallons per day from 3 clustered springs. Summers was convinced. On June 6th, he presented his findings to the town council. The spring system Miss Hawkins described is real and reliable. The 8 undeveloped sites combined could provide approximately 1,600 gallons per day. Developed properly, perhaps 1,800 gallons per day. Added to Miss Hawkins's existing 800 gallons per day, we're looking at a potential 2,600 gallons per day from spring sources. Development costs? Whitmore asked. Lower than drilling wells, Summers said. We're not digging to 200 feet. We're building collection basins, stone channels, and pipe systems to transport water downhill to town. Hard physical labor, but nothing requiring steam equipment or specialized drilling. I estimate we could develop all 8 sites for under $1,500 total. Timeline? If we commit a full crew, maybe 3 months to build the collection and transport systems. We could prioritize the highest yielding sites and have some operational within a month. James Ridgway objected. This is going backwards. We're talking about Stone Age water collection when we should be drilling deeper wells or finding ways to better manage the aquifer. The aquifer is depleted, James, Summers said bluntly. I've been telling you that for months. Drilling more wells won't help. We need different water sources, and the springs offer that. They're not affected by the drought, because they're releasing old water from tight fractures. It's actually clever geology once you understand it. Whitmore looked at Sarah. Miss Hawkins, you identified these springs. You've maintained the existing system. Would you be willing to help guide the development work? Sarah hadn't expected this. I'm a school teacher, Mr. Whitmore. I maintain my uncle's system because he left it to me. I'm not an engineer. You know more about springs than anyone else in this town, Whitmore said. Your uncle spent 30 years learning this. You've spent the last 15 months maintaining his work. We need that knowledge. Would you consult on the project? We'd pay for your time. Sarah considered. School was ending for the summer in 2 weeks. She'd have the time. And she'd spent 15 months being mocked for maintaining obsolete water systems. The chance to prove her uncle was right all along held considerable appeal. I'll help, she said, on one condition. Whatever we build has to be maintained properly. These systems need constant attention. You can't just build them and forget them. Agreed, Whitmore said. We'll hire someone for ongoing maintenance. First priority is getting them built and flowing. Council votes. Do we proceed with spring development? The vote was unanimous. Even Ridgway voted yes, though reluctantly. Silver Creek would build a spring collection system. The work began on June 10, 1875. Robert Summers assembled a crew of 12 men, a mix of miners between jobs and day laborers, glad for steady work. Charles Whitmore provided funding from the Mine Owners Consortium. Sarah served as guide and technical consultant, working 6 days per week through the summer. The first site developed was the cluster of 3 springs on the north slope, the highest yielding location. The crew built 3 collection basins using the same technique Thomas Brennan had perfected. Carefully fitted stones, clay sand lime mortar for waterproofing, precise positioning to capture maximum flow. Sarah showed them how to read the ground for water movement, how to position collection basins to intercept the seeps, how to build channels that wouldn't erode. The work was physically demanding, hauling stones up slopes, mixing mortar, fitting each piece carefully. The men initially approached the work with some skepticism. This wasn't mining or drilling. It was more like elaborate gardening. But as they saw water begin flowing steadily through the completed channels, feeding into temporary holding ponds, the skepticism faded. By June 25th, the North Slope site was operational. 3 collection basins, 400 yards of stone channel, and a crude pipe system delivered roughly 400 gallons per day to a cistern site near the road. The water flowed steadily, clear and cold. The crew moved to the second site, a pair of springs on an east-facing hillside. This location required more extensive channel work because the springs were 200 yards apart. Sarah designed a system that captured both springs and combined their flow into a single transport pipe. Development proceeded through July and August. One site at a time, the crew built collection basins, carved or built channels, laid pipe. Some locations went quickly. Others required extensive rock work or regrading to achieve proper flow. Sarah learned more about her uncle's work through the process of replicating it. Thomas had understood principles of gravity flow, hydraulic grade, and sediment management that weren't written in any textbook, but came from decades of careful observation. Sarah absorbed this knowledge and passed it on to the crew. The town's water crisis worsened through the summer. The 4 deep wells combined were producing less than 900 gallons per hour by August. Rationing became severe. The mills operated minimal schedules. Fires were a constant terror, with inadequate water for fighting them. But as each new spring site came online, the pressure eased slightly. Sarah's original 800 gallons per day was augmented by 400 from the north slope, then 200 from the east hillside, then 180 from a western seep, then 250 from a south-facing cluster. By late August, the spring system was delivering approximately 2,100 gallons per day, not enough to replace the failing wells, but enough to cover the deficit and provide a small margin. The town's water supply stabilized. The final 2 spring sites were completed in September, bringing total spring production to 2,650 gallons per day. Combined with the reduced but still functioning wells, Silver Creek had adequate water for current needs. The crisis had passed, barely. The completion of the spring network in September 1875 marked a turning point in Silver Creek's perception of Sarah Hawkins and her uncle's legacy. The ridicule that had followed her for 18 months evaporated, replaced by grudging respect and, in some cases, open admiration. The most dramatic moment came at a town council meeting on September 18, 1875. A meeting was held to formally accept the spring system as completed and discuss ongoing maintenance. Sarah attended, sitting in her usual spot in the back of the hall. Charles Whitmore opened the meeting with a status report. The spring development project is complete. 8 new sites are operational, producing approximately 1,850 gallons per day. Combined with Miss Hawkins's original system, total spring production is 2,650 gallons per day. This water is reliable, independent of aquifer levels, and has maintained consistent flow throughout the drought. He paused and continued. I want to acknowledge that Miss Hawkins and her late uncle were right about the value of these springs when the rest of us were wrong. Thomas Brennan understood something about the local geology that our engineers missed. His niece had the judgment to recognize that understanding and the courage to maintain his work. Despite considerable mockery from this community, several people nodded. James Ridgway, sitting near the front, looked uncomfortable. Whitmore turned to Sarah. Miss Hawkins, on behalf of the town council and the citizens of Silver Creek, I want to thank you for your contribution. Your uncle's knowledge and your willingness to preserve it quite literally saved this town. Without the spring system, we'd be hauling water from 10 miles away at enormous cost or evacuating the population. You've done us a great service. Sarah stood, feeling every eye in the room on her. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. My uncle deserves the credit. I just maintained what he built and shared his knowledge when it mattered. You did more than that, Whitmore said. You trusted documented evidence over popular opinion. You committed to maintaining a system everyone thought was worthless. And you had the grace not to say, I told you so, when you were proven right. After the meeting, people approached Sarah to express gratitude or apologize for earlier skepticism. Henry Morton, the general store owner, shook her hand. Your uncle was smarter than we gave him credit for. I'm glad you had the sense to listen to him. Mrs. Porter, Sarah's landlady, was more direct. I told you to sell that property. I was wrong. You showed better judgment than the rest of us. The most significant apology came from James Ridgway. He waited until most people had left, then approached Sarah near the door. Miss Hawkins, I owe you an apology. I was rude and dismissive when you chose to maintain your uncle's springs. I called it foolish and unseemly. I was wrong on both counts. Thank you for saying so, Mr. Ridgway, Sarah said. I'm an engineer, Ridgway continued. I'm supposed to understand geology and water systems. Your uncle, with no formal training, understood this mountain's hydrology better than I did. That's humbling. I should have listened instead of assuming I knew better. My uncle had 30 years to learn, Sarah said. And he learned by observing carefully and recording what he saw. That's worth something. Ridgway nodded. It's worth a great deal, as it turns out. Will you continue maintaining the spring system? The town's hiring someone for that, Sarah said. I'll help train them, but I have my teaching duties. Of course. Ridgway hesitated, then added, I'd like to study your uncle's notebook sometime, if you permit it. I want to understand how he figured out the difference between aquifer water and fracture water. That knowledge could be valuable in other locations. Sarah agreed. Over the following weeks, Ridgway spent several evenings studying Thomas Brennan's documentation. He came away impressed by the careful observation and logical reasoning evident in the notes. Thomas hadn't known formal geological terminology, but he'd understood the principles through direct experience. Ridgway later published a paper in a Denver engineering journal describing Silver Creek's spring development project and the geological principles involved. He credited Thomas Brennan's observational work and Sarah's guidance throughout. The paper brought attention to the value of understanding multiple water sources in drought-prone regions. Through the fall of 1875 and into 1876, the spring system became Silver Creek's primary water source. The deep wells continued operating, but their contribution diminished as the aquifer remained depleted. By spring 1876, the four wells combined were producing only 600 gallons per hour, about a quarter of their original capacity. The springs, meanwhile, continued their steady output. Rains returned in spring 1876, ending the long drought, but the spring flow remained unchanged. Wet or dry, the water emerged at the same consistent rate. The town council hired a full-time maintenance worker for the spring system in October 1875. They chose a man named Frank Holloway, a former miner who proved adept at the detailed work required. Sarah spent the fall training Holloway in maintenance procedures, showing him how to clean basins, repair channels, monitor flow rates, and identify problems before they became serious. "Your uncle really knew what he was doing," Holloway said one afternoon while they were repairing a channel on the north slope. "Every part of this system is designed for a reason. Nothing's wasted. It's all efficient." He had 30 years to figure it out, Sarah said, and he learned from his mistakes. The first systems he built weren't this good. He kept improving. "Did he ever teach anyone else?" Holloway asked. "Not systematically," Sarah said. "He'd show people things if they asked, but most people thought he was crazy to spend so much time on springs. You're the first person who's been paid to maintain this kind of system." "Won't be the last," Holloway predicted. This drought proved that deep wells can fail. Springs don't. Every mining town in the Rockies should have a spring system as backup. Your uncle's methods could be valuable all over the territory. Holloway proved right. News of Silver Creek's spring development spread through mining communities across Colorado. Several towns sent representatives to study the system and consult with Sarah and Summers about adapting the techniques to their locations. In 1876 and 1877, similar spring development projects began in 4 other mountain towns. Not all succeeded. Some locations lacked suitable spring sites, but where appropriate geology existed, the methods worked. Sarah consulted on 2 of these projects, traveling to other towns during summer breaks to share her uncle's knowledge. By 1878, spring collection systems were recognized as valuable supplementary water sources for mountain communities. Engineers began including spring surveys in their water development plans. Thomas Brennan's techniques, refined through Sarah's guidance and Summers' engineering input, became standard practice in certain applications. The knowledge spread gradually through the informal networks connecting mining towns. A superintendent who'd seen Silver Creek's system would mention it to colleagues elsewhere. An engineer who'd read Ridgway's paper would investigate springs at his next posting. A town facing water shortages would hear about the spring option and send someone to learn how it worked. Sarah's role in saving Silver Creek brought changes to her life beyond simple respect. The town council voted in November 1875 to pay her a consulting fee of $200 for her work guiding the spring development project, a substantial sum equivalent to nearly 6 months of her teaching salary. More significantly, the experience connected her with people who valued her knowledge. Robert Summers, the town engineer, began consulting her regularly on water-related questions. Charles Whitmore, impressed by her judgment and expertise, hired her to evaluate water resources at a new mining claim he was developing. Other mine owners followed suit. By 1876, Sarah had established a modest consulting practice alongside her teaching work. She evaluated spring sites, advised on water system design, and helped troubleshoot problems with existing systems. The work paid well and gave her professional standing unusual for an unmarried woman in a mining town. Her relationship with James Ridgway evolved as well. His initial condescension transformed into genuine respect and eventually into something more. They married in June 1877. Sarah was 32, James 38. The marriage was a partnership of equals, both bringing professional expertise and practical judgment to the relationship. They built a house on Sarah's property, using her uncle's land not for the springs themselves, but for a home site with spectacular valley views. The house included several innovations adapted from spring system principles: a gravity-fed water supply from the cisterns, careful attention to drainage patterns, and design elements that worked with the landscape rather than fighting it. Sarah continued teaching through 1878, then retired from classroom work when her first child was born in 1879. She maintained her consulting practice, working from home and traveling for evaluations when needed. She and James had 3 children between 1879 and 1885. The spring system remained central to Silver Creek's water supply. As population grew through the 1880s, additional springs were developed using Thomas Brennan's methods. By 1890, the town's spring network produced over 5,000 gallons per day from 18 developed sites. The deep wells recovered somewhat as the drought eased, but they never returned to original capacity. Engineers understood better now the limits of aquifer-based systems. Springs provided valuable backup and supplementation. Sarah maintained an advisory role in the spring system's expansion through the 1880s and 1890s. She trained subsequent maintenance workers, reviewed proposed new developments, and solved problems when unusual situations arose. Her understanding of the system's principles, learned from her uncle's documentation and her own experience, made her the local expert on mountain hydrology. The spring system Sarah inherited and expanded became Thomas Brennan's most lasting contribution to Silver Creek. The mines that had drawn people to the valley eventually played out. The town shrank from its peak population of over 2,000 in the 1880s to a few hundred permanent residents by 1900. But the spring system kept functioning. The stone basins and channels Thomas had built in the 1850s and 1860s were still operational in 1900. The cisterns Sarah had repaired in the 1870s still held water. The collection methods Thomas had developed through decades of observation remained effective. Modern engineers who studied the system in later years were impressed by its sophistication. Thomas Brennan had understood principles of hydraulic grade, flow dynamics, and seasonal variation without formal training. He'd learned by watching how water moved, by recording patterns over decades, by experimenting with different approaches until he found what worked. His documentation proved invaluable beyond Silver Creek. Notebooks Sarah inherited contained observations applicable to spring development throughout the Rocky Mountains. The records showed which techniques worked in different geological conditions, how flow patterns varied with seasons, what maintenance procedures prevented long-term degradation. Water engineers in the early 1900s, when Sarah was in her 50s and 60s, would sometimes visit her to discuss her uncle's work. She'd walk them through the system, explaining the principles Thomas had discovered, showing how each element served a specific purpose. "Your uncle was ahead of his time," one engineer told her in 1905. "We're only now developing the formal understanding of mountain hydrology that he figured out through observation 60 years ago." Sarah, then 60 years old, smiled at the comment. He wasn't ahead of his time. He was just paying attention to what the land was telling him. Most people were too busy looking for gold to notice how water actually worked. The spring system outlasted Sarah's lifetime. She died in 1929 at age 84, still living in the house on her uncle's property. The springs were still flowing, still maintained according to Thomas Brennan's methods, still providing reliable water to the much-reduced population of Silver Creek. The final irony was that the deep wells, the modern engineered solution, that everyone had trusted in the 1870s were abandoned in the 1920s. The pumping equipment wore out, and the cost of replacement couldn't be justified for a shrinking town. The springs, requiring only routine maintenance, kept flowing at negligible ongoing cost. What Thomas Brennan developed and Sarah preserved wasn't revolutionary technology. Spring collection systems existed in many cultures. Stone channels and cisterns were ancient techniques. The principles of gravity flow and hydraulic management were well understood by experienced engineers. Thomas's innovation was recognition, understanding that mountain hydrology involved multiple water sources with different characteristics, behaviors, and reliability patterns. The deep aquifer provided volume but fluctuated with precipitation. The fracture systems provided consistency but lower volume. A robust water system needed both. This recognition came from careful observation over decades. Thomas had documented flow rates, compared different sources, noted which springs maintained flow during dry periods and which didn't. He'd learned to read the landscape for signs of reliable water, to understand how geology affected spring behavior, to predict which sites would perform consistently. Sarah's contribution was trust, trusting her uncle's documentation over popular consensus, maintaining the system when everyone thought it was worthless, sharing the knowledge when crisis made it relevant. She could have sold the property in 1873 and avoided the mockery and physical labor. Instead, she committed to preserving what Thomas had learned. The combination of Thomas's observation and Sarah's preservation created knowledge that benefited Silver Creek and, eventually, other mountain communities. The specific techniques mattered less than the underlying lesson. Reliable water supply requires understanding all available sources, their characteristics, and their limitations. Modern water engineering eventually formalized these principles. Engineers learned to evaluate multiple sources, design redundant systems, consider both high volume and steady flow options. But in 1870s Colorado, when deep wells seemed like the obvious solution to water supply, Thomas Brennan's decades of spring observation looked like outdated eccentricity. The drought of 1874 to 1875 proved the value of his approach. Deep wells had higher capacity, but depended on aquifer recharge. Springs had lower capacity, but drew from older, more stable water stores. Both had roles to play. Understanding the difference was crucial. The Silver Creek Spring Development Project influenced water management practices across the Rocky Mountain mining region through the late 19th century. The combination of reliability demonstrated during the drought and the lower development costs compared to deep wells made spring systems attractive supplementary sources for many communities. Between 1875 and 1890, at least 20 mining towns in Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming developed spring collection systems based partly on the Silver Creek model. Not all succeeded. Geology varied considerably, but where suitable conditions existed, the approach worked. The economic impact was substantial. Towns with diverse water sources proved more resilient during dry years, maintaining mining operations and population when communities dependent solely on wells faced shortages. This resilience translated into economic stability and growth. The environmental impact, though not well understood at the time, was also significant. Spring systems required less energy input than steam-powered deep wells, reducing fuel consumption and air pollution. The collection methods worked with natural water flow patterns rather than depleting aquifers through rapid pumping. Health outcomes may have improved as well. Spring water, filtered through rock over years, tended to be cleaner and lower in harmful minerals than water from some deep wells. Though the health implications weren't well understood in the 1870s, the preference many people had for spring water over well water had some basis in water quality differences. The social impact centered on knowledge sharing. Sarah's willingness to consult on other towns' water projects, to explain her uncle's methods, to train people in maintenance procedures, exemplified the collaborative approach necessary in frontier communities. Individual expertise became community knowledge, benefiting everyone. Sarah Hawkins Ridgway continued consulting on water projects through the 1890s, though her work declined as her children required more attention, and as standard engineering practices incorporated lessons from spring development projects. By 1900, she was essentially retired from professional work, though she remained a resource for questions about the Silver Creek system. She maintained a detailed journal throughout her life, documenting not just the spring system, but her observations of mountain life, climate patterns, community development, and social change. Her journals, preserved by her descendants, provide valuable historical records of life in a Colorado mining town through periods of boom, crisis, and gradual decline. Her marriage to James Ridgway lasted until his death in 1917. They'd been married 40 years, raised 3 children who all survived to adulthood, and built a respected position in the community. James's initial skepticism about spring systems became a family joke, something he acknowledged freely in later years. "I was wrong, and Sarah was right," he'd say when the topic came up. "Took me 6 months to figure that out, but I got there eventually." Their children inherited both the property and the knowledge. One son became a civil engineer, working on water projects throughout the West. One daughter married a mining superintendent and served as unofficial water consultant for his operations. The youngest child, a daughter, became a teacher like Sarah, working in small mountain schools for 30 years. Sarah watched Silver Creek's population decline through the early 1900s as mines played out and young people moved to larger towns. The community that had numbered over 2,000 in the 1880s dropped to under 300 by 1920. The spring system, designed for a much larger population, provided abundant water for the reduced community. She took some satisfaction in seeing the springs outlast the mines. The quest for gold had built the town, but Thomas Brennan's careful observation of water had sustained it through crisis and eventually proved more enduring than the ore deposits everyone had come for. The story of Sarah Hawkins and her worthless inheritance offers lessons that extended beyond 1870s Colorado. The core principles remain relevant. The value of long-term observation over short-term trends. The importance of understanding systems rather than just exploiting resources. The wisdom of maintaining diverse options rather than relying on single solutions. Thomas Brennan's 30 years of documenting springs taught him things that engineers with formal training missed because he watched patiently while they assumed they already knew the answers. His notebooks contained accumulated knowledge that proved crucial during crisis. Sarah's decision to trust that knowledge over popular opinion required judgment and courage. She endured mockery, worked physically demanding labor, and maintained systems everyone thought were obsolete. But she was proven right when crisis exposed the limitations of the modern approach. The drought revealed what should have been obvious. In an unpredictable environment, resilience requires redundancy and diversity. Depending entirely on deep wells made Silver Creek vulnerable to aquifer depletion. Having spring systems as backup provided security during the crisis and ongoing supplementation afterward. The broader lesson transcends water management. It's about the value of careful observation, the importance of preserving knowledge that seems obsolete, the wisdom of maintaining multiple approaches rather than assuming any single solution is sufficient. Thomas Brennan's obsessive maintenance of springs that nobody valued saved his town when modern engineering failed. Sarah's willingness to continue that work, despite ridicule, preserved the knowledge until it mattered. Together, they demonstrated that careful observation of natural systems over decades could produce understanding as valuable as formal engineering, and sometimes more so. Sarah Catherine Ridgway died on April 14, 1929, at age 84. She'd lived long enough to see automobiles replace wagons, electricity light the streets of Silver Creek, and radio bring the world to remote mountain towns. The world had changed dramatically since her arrival in 1872, but the springs on her property still flowed at roughly the same rate Thomas Brennan had documented in the 1840s. The stone basins he'd built still captured water. The channels still carried flow downhill to the cisterns. The system still supplied Silver Creek with reliable water 75 years after Thomas began building it. The property remained in family hands through Sarah's descendants. The spring system continued operating through the 20th century, eventually supplemented by modern wells and municipal water systems, but never entirely replaced. Even in the 2000s, some of Thomas Brennan's original stonework was still visible, still functional, testimony to careful construction and patient observation. Sarah's grave in the Silver Creek Cemetery overlooks the valley and the rocky hillside where her uncle's springs still flow. The stone marker reads simply, Sarah Catherine Hawkins Ridgway, 1845 to 1929. She trusted the water. That trust and the knowledge behind it proved more valuable than anyone in Silver Creek imagined when they mocked her inheritance in 1873. Sometimes the most worthless seeming legacy contains wisdom that circumstances will eventually vindicate. Sometimes the patient work of observation and maintenance matters more than the dramatic gesture of new engineering. Thomas Brennan understood that. Sarah Hawkins learned it. And Silver Creek survived because of it. The springs still flow. For more interesting stories, check this out.